Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome on behalf of AlgorithmWatch. My name is Mackenzie Nelson, and I'm heading our Governing Platforms project. And I'm really excited for today's event. It's going to be, I think, a real treat. I just got a chance to peek at the Executive Vice President's Keynote Address. Andreas will introduce her in a moment, but I just wanted to say welcome on our end. Unfortunately, we're not in Brussels and I am not in the European Parliament. That's fake news. That was the original plan, but of course, coronavirus had other plans for us. Nevertheless, I'm very happy to welcome everyone today and would like to quickly thank Civitatis for funding our project and also our project partners at the University of Amsterdam and the Mainz Media Institutes. And without further ado, because I know that the Executive Vice President needs to run pretty much at 10:30 sharp, I'll hand it over to Andreas for the more formal introductions, and I'll be coming back a little bit later to be presenting our recommendations and introducing what I think is going to be a really fantastic panel.
Thank you, Kenzie, very much for this introduction. So, thank you all. My name is Andreas Aktudianakis, and I am the Digital Policy Analyst at the European Policy Center. So thank you for joining us today for this timely policy dialogue at the EPC about putting meaningful transparency at the heart of the Digital Services Act. The Digital Services Act has been our main focus in this project, and this is why it gives us great pleasure to have with us today Executive Vice President Margarethe Vestager. Vice President, thank you for accepting our invitation to speak on this topic. We have followed your work very closely over the years, and we have published on the Digital Services Act and provided feedback to the consultations, and we hope that our recommendations from this project will be useful to your team as they're drafting it. Yes, we hope that this debate will help steer more dialogue about putting meaningful transparency in the DSA, and without further ado, I would like to offer you the floor, as we are all looking forward to hearing from you on this timely topic.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be part of the discussion today, because what you have been doing over the last year in your project is really impressive and very valuable. I think the whole idea of AlgorithmWatch, and not least the governing project, that is, I think, very influential in how things will be done in the near future. And I noticed in one of the reports that you have been producing, the title asks a very fundamental question: are algorithms a threat to democracy? And that is an issue that is basically at the heart of our work. Because the future of Europe, how we put our values into reality, how we enable each other's freedoms, well, that depends on how we answer that question. And it's a surprisingly simple question, but it's not simple to answer. Because digitization obviously brings a lot of benefits as well as harms to democracy. Digital technology that has helped up opening public debate. It has given many more people the chances to have their voices heard. And that has enriched our debates, ideas, perspectives, many things that we simply didn't know before or didn't see before have been able to surface. That has helped organize protest against unjust governments. And you can see from the internet blackouts in Belarus that those rulers, well, they really understand and fear the power of digital communication. And the fact that digitization has this potential of bringing us all together as citizens and politicians and breaking down power hierarchies, well, that sort of gives us the potential of a continuing conversation. maybe one can find sort of a metaphor of as a modern version of the agora in ancient Athens, of course with the caveat that the agora was for free men, no women allowed, no unfree people either. So with that important caveat, our digital public spaces, they give citizens a chance to have their voices heard to leaders, not only at election times, but throughout the year. Of course, the modern agora holds everyone who wants to join, not just a few thousand people, but billions. And that, of course, makes for an intense, illuminating discussion. But with so many voices speaking at once, well, it risks of creating a cacophony. And it's not humanly possible to make sense of such a vast amount of information. And that, of course, is where the platforms, they come in. Because platforms, they help us to find our way in the jungle of information there's out there on the internet. And they rely on algorithms for them to do that in a quick and effective way. They use recommender systems to select the things that are most relevant for us. The next video to watch, the next product to buy, the next opinion or bit of news at the top of our social media feed. They use content moderation systems to track down and remove harmful system from the platforms, whether that content is illegal or just against the terms and of service that are designed to stop discussions descending into abuse. And of course, they use also advertising algorithms to target ads exactly at the people that advertisers wants to reach. And algorithms like that, well, that's the secret of success in huge platforms. But they can also have a serious effect on the health of our democracy by influencing how we see the world around us. When recommender systems choose which information to promote and what then also to hide, they profoundly affect what we know about the world. We naturally assume that the things that we see first, well, that they are the most important, the most accurate news, the most widely shared opinions. And the things that are pushed lower down in our feeds, well, or removed altogether by content moderation systems, well, those things might just as well not exist. That's good news, of course, when it comes to illegal content. But a lot of the time, it means that these systems are choosing which legitimate arguments and ideas that we see, all without asking our permission or even telling us what they're doing. It's a bit like maybe The Truman Show, just to reveal my generation, the film where Jim Carrey lives in a world that he thinks is real, but which is really just a TV show. The world that we see through these platforms seems so real that it can be hard to remember that it's actually constructed. It is built up through the choices that algorithms make about what we should see. Of course, there's nothing new at all in the fact that the information that we see are being filtered before it gets to us. Back in the days when I was watching Flow TV News, they would end the news show by saying, "These were the news we chose to show you tonight." They would sort of declare that they had made choices. And the thing is also, when you pick up a newspaper on paper or also digitally, well, you will very often know that they may have a certain political leaning and editorial line, So you will have a pretty good idea about what kind of filtering have been done here. And if you want to, well, you can compare the stories in print with what other papers at the newsstand, what they would have to say. And of course, you can do that with papers online as well. But when the choices of what to show us are made by algorithms, it can be very difficult to understand how they made their decisions. And it can be a jungle to try to understand and judge whether they are giving us accurate information about the world. In addition, algorithm gives each and every one of us a different picture of the world. After all, this extreme targeting is one of the great selling points of today's digital technology. But it's also hard to compare notes. It's hard to check if we're seeing the same picture as our fellow citizens, to check whether it's only we who actually, and our social media providers, who actually knows what is going through our feed. So if a recommender system draws some users down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theory or violent material, well, then part of the danger comes from the fact that the rest of us have no idea what is going on. We don't know the sort of arguments that other people are hearing, and that, of course, makes it very hard to discuss it. It makes it hard to counteract. It also makes it hard to agree. And that is a sense of privatizing our democracy, counter to the agora, where you were there in common and you could hear the views that you agreed or disagreed with. You could hear the facts that you thought about, whether you thought was true or not. And the point is that this lack of shared reality also can make it easier for these systems to discriminate against some groups of people. It can make it very hard for us to tell if the ads that we see, that they are being tailored in a way that limits our opportunities because of our gender, because of our ethnicity. And it's often only when you carry out experiments like AlgorithmWatch has done that you discover that these algorithms, they are discriminating. There's no doubt, in other words, that platforms and the algorithms that they use, they have an enormous impact on how we see the world around us. And that is a serious challenge for our democracy. Because today, a few big platforms, they are increasingly important as the place where we go for news, for information, the place where we carry out our political debates, where we engage with democracy. And we cannot just leave decisions which affect the future of our democracy to be made in secrecy in a few corporate boardrooms. And that is why one of the main goals of the Digital Services Act, we will put that forward in December, will be to protect our democracy by making sure that platforms are transparent about how these algorithms work and make those platforms more accountable for the decisions that they make. So the proposal that we're working on would mean that platforms would have to tell users how their recommender systems decide what content to show, so that it's easier for us to judge whether to trust the picture of the world they give us or not. Those platforms would have to provide regular reports on the content moderation tools they use, the accuracy, the results of those tools. And they'd have to give us better information about the ads that we're seeing, explaining, for example, who placed a certain ad and why it has been targeted at us. And that gives us a much better idea about who is trying to influence us and a better chance of spotting when an algorithm is discriminating against us. At the same time, these rules will also give more power to users, so that algorithms do not have the last word about what we get to see and what we do not get to see. Digital service providers will have to tell us users when they take content down and give people an effective right to challenge that removal. And they'll also have to give us the ability to influence the choices that recommender systems makes on our behalf. The Digital Services Act will also make sure that regulators get the information they need to understand and govern the way that algorithms work. And researchers too need to have access to data that allows us to understand how those algorithms are affecting our society. Because we've seen the impact of the choices that they have made. And we have seen that it's not always obvious until you get to dig down in the data and fully understand what is going on. And since those choices, well, they affect all of us directly or indirectly, that sort of knowledge cannot be a sort of esoteric piece of information that only a small sort of priesthood that works at big platforms gets to see. So the rules that we're preparing, they would give all service providers a duty to cooperate with regulators. And the biggest platforms would have to provide more information about how their algorithms actually work when a regulator would ask for that. And they'd also have to give regulators and researchers access to the data that they hold, including ad archives. Understanding the way that algorithms work, making sure that they don't undermine our democracy. That is enough of a challenge at the best of times, but it can be especially difficult when those algorithms rely on artificial intelligence. AI systems, well, they can make platforms, they can help platforms filter and select information in a way that's more, well, obviously intelligent, but they can also be a black box, making decisions that no one really understands, not even the people who designed it, who put it in place. And in that case, there is no way that users and regulators can hope to understand the logic behind those decisions. AI can also allow discrimination to creep more easily into the way that platforms work. If they are trained on biased data, they can learn to repeat the same biases. Sadly, our societies have a grim history of prejudice, and you need to work very, very hard to get that bias out of your data, out of how the systems are working. And if we don't know how they're making decisions, we cannot be sure that those choices are not based on harmful stereotypes, and to challenge those decisions if they're unfair. So the EU ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI requires AI systems to be explainable to regulators, to researchers, and to users, so that we can understand how those systems make decisions. They insist, the guidelines, that AI systems avoid unfair biases, that users have accessible processes available in order to be able to get redressed if they are harmed by those systems' decisions. And the very similar principle are also at the heart of the global approach to ethical AI, not least in the AI principles that the G20 leaders approved last year. And these are the sort of principles that we rely on when we put forward new EU rules early next year to create what we call the AI ecosystem of trust. So to conclude, because if we are asking whether algorithms is a threat to democracy, well, the answer is surely yes, they can be, but they don't have to be. Because our democracy has the power to protect themselves with rules that make sure that such algorithms work in a way they should. And in the last few months and years, I think that consensus has been growing, that the time has come to put those rules in place. It's time for our democracy to catch up, so that it's not a boardroom decision how our democracy will work. It's a democratic decision. It is from each and every one that power comes to our representatives to decide how our society should develop, how our democracy should be transparent, and for us to take part in. And that consensus that you see it in groups in civil society, AlgorithmWatch being an obvious one, with the valuable evidence that you have produced, how these algorithms can threaten democracy and how we can best respond to those threats. We need that insight, we need that knowledge, we need that passion for a democracy that actually works. And we've also seen it from other European institutions, like in the excellent report which the European Parliament produced a few weeks ago on the Digital Services Act, or the Council Presidency conclusions from just last week, which give welcome support to our plans for transparency and human oversight of artificial intelligence. And that's what the Digital Services Act is there for, not to undermine the great benefits that we get from platforms, but to make sure that we, as a society, that we're in control. And these platforms, well, they should be what they should be, a tool that enable us to make sense of the vast amount of information, of all the many, many voices, and not the guardians of that decide what we can see and what we cannot see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice President, for this comprehensive review. Your points go right to the heart of our work, and there's a lot to unpack there too. Being aware of your busy schedule, I would like to ask if you would have some time to explore with me a couple of follow-up questions we might have, if that's okay.
Yes, of course, you're welcome.
Thank you. So you spoke about principles, and this is exactly what we have in mind too. I was wondering, if you could perhaps tell us a little bit more about enforcement of these principles. And we know previously, we remember you have said that we need to lay down a solid and impactful EU-wide accountability framework for this. So I was wondering, what would be the options there for enforcement? How can we ensure that enforcement will have teeth, so to speak, in enforcing the DSA?
Well, it's both the DSA, but also the framework for artificial intelligence, where this is sort of the heart of our considerations. And we have not taken final decisions yet, because it can obviously been done in a number of ways. But the important thing is that it gets to work, because if one has to choose between something very, very elaborate but very difficult to enforce, or something maybe more robust and easier to enforce, I'm clearly in favor of the last solution. Because I have seen how, in my experience in working in politics, that the real test of any piece of legislation is, of course, in whether or not it's enforceable. So there are, scaling from very centralized European enforcement to networks between European enforcement and national enforcement, to leaving it to national enforcement. I myself think that we need sort of the middle situation. We need a European competence, but we also need for member states to engage here, because as with democracy, obviously ownership is very, very important. And I think an ownership among regulators will also be part of the transparency, which is one of the main sort of ideas that go through both the Digital Services Act and the AI framework.
Thank you. Of course, yes, the AI framework together with the DSA, there will have to be synergy there and its enforcement across the EU. Perhaps we could also touch a little bit upon on other developments that need to be happening in tandem with enforcing the DSA. So maybe here I can refer back to a previous regulatory success, the GDPR. Which set down big foundations for other developments to take place, like the DSA. We have heard that there is a weak enforcement of the GDPR across some member states due to discrepancies in abilities. So perhaps if you can think of any other developments that we need to be enforcing better, that is existing legislation ahead of the DSA.
The thing with the GDPR, which is basically the closest that we come to sort of digital citizens' rights, that you have the right to be forgotten, you own your data, you can have your data, there's transparency. The thing is, one thing is that you set a global standard, because we have seen how this piece of legislation have inspired countries around the planet. We still have work to do in enforcing it and in empowering individuals to make best use of it. Here, I see that technology is also catching up here. You see more and more pieces of technology to help us enforce our rights. But I think we miss a very important piece here. And that is the European digital identity, because the fact that you use social media accounts to identify yourself, you basically just create, a completely open door to all of your data, and that makes it very difficult to have ownership and being empowered in using your rights when it comes to GDPR. What I mean by digital identity is sort of the same kind of logic that you have in a passport. The state where you're a citizen would identify you, and they would do that with only the needed information to identify you, and they would not pass on more information than what is needed to identify you. And you would know, if you identify yourself and your counterpart or your discussion partner, they identify yourself, you will know who is actually there. And I think that's a very important stepping stone in enabling people to control their data. Because right now, it's of course anecdotal and it's just my own experience, it seems as if the more they need your data for their business model, the more difficult it is to see through the consent that you have to give.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this. Maybe one last question. I was wondering if you could, expand a little bit beyond EU and consider what sort of ripple effect the Digital Services Act can have for internet global governance, so to speak. How can we ensure that as a framework, and the framework it's going to set in place and enforce is going to, increase EU conditionality, so to speak, and
it's difficult to try to inspire others before we know ourselves exactly what we want to do. So of course, with that caveat, only if this works, if we are indeed clever and lucky and work closely together so that it's good, that we can hope to inspire other people. But the thing is, looking at the world, that there are, I think, two things at stake here, because more and more people realize, I think, that we do not have an offline world and an online world. We have a world, which is why there is a kind of struggle about then when the digital world becomes imperialistic of our offline world, how should governance then work? For instance, we have seen in the International Telecommunications Union, someone trying to sort of turn the internet protocols upside down. So instead of this extremely decentralized, ungovernable internet, you'd have a centralized, governable internet. And I think that's a very good example as to what is at stake now. Because what we are trying to do with the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and the AI framework is indeed to say offline and online, this is the same value system. This is the same world. And we want to have the same strong rights, empowerment, transparency in the entire world. And this is why what we're doing here is so inspired by the democracy that we have already, our values of transparency, of accountability, of responsibility that we have already. And I think that is the real fight. That is when to take the legal consequences of the fact that we have one world, no matter what form it takes or what shape it takes, that we have one world. And this is a fight for a liberal democracy. We just have changed the battleground as from what it was 100 years ago when women were allowed in, or 1,000 or a couple of thousand years ago when it was also men and free men only. So this is a democratic battle for a liberal democracy, where it is still so that the individual, the respect of the individual, the worthiness of the individual, the integrity, that is the starting point. And this is why I'm so passionate about it.
Thank you, Vice President. This is fascinating and a great pleasure to be speaking with you and hearing from you directly. We are extremely passionate too about the same principles, and we hope that we can continue working closely with you and your team in the future as part of this project and other projects. Knowing that you must be very busy in your work, I wouldn't like to keep you any longer. So I would just like to thank you very much on behalf of the APC and AlgorithmWatch, our partner, and the Governing Platforms project overall.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for what you do. And I sit here with a sense of envy that I cannot stay on because I would learn a lot, and I would really get inspired by the work you do. So of course we will continue cooperating. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I will pass now the floor to my colleague Mackenzie Nelson from AlgorithmWatch. Mackenzie, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Andreas. And I hope everyone is feeling as inspired as I am after that really stellar keynote. And I think also the last question kind of brought it to the core of what it is that our project has been focusing on for the past year, and that is how we can make democracy or how we can translate democratic principles into the digital realm as well. For those of you who are only now just joining us, my name is Mackenzie Nelson, and I head the Governing Platforms project now on the AlgorithmWatch end. And the Executive Vice President referenced, of course, some of the recommendations that we've been preparing over the past year. But now is our opportunity to formally present some of our ideas. And before I jump right into telling you why we think that data access for research matters and why we can't have meaningful transparency without it, I wanted to give a quick shout out and thank you to all the organizations who contributed to these recommendations with their expertise and their comments and their time. It wouldn't have been possible without all of you. And if you're curious to see who all is behind the recommendations, you can go over to our website. We'll also be posting a link momentarily. But first things first, because it's Friday morning, and let's be honest, even for the nerdiest of policy wonks, data access for research can sound terribly dry. So what we did at AlgorithmWatch is we asked an artist to help spice things up and hopefully make things a little bit more entertaining for all of you Zoomers at home. So I wanted to kick things off with a little story. And this is a story about a data scientist working for a watchdog organization conducting research on hate speech and disinformation. And this researcher told us, she reached out to us over the summer, and she told us that she started working on these topics because she was concerned that the algorithms that are used to curate, rank, and remove content online were sowing hate and division, and that they were creating social polarization, some of the challenges that the vice president also outlined in her speech. And this watchdog told us that she was also very concerned by what she saw as a lack of evidence in policy issues or policy discussions about how to address these issues. And she wanted to do her part to help shed light on what was going on within these black box systems. So she reached out to the platform, as most researchers in her position would do, and she asked them to get access to its API, which would enable her to have access to the information that she needed to understand how platforms were shaping public discourse online. And in order to gain access to this data, she needed to jump through all kinds of hoops. She had to submit multiple requests to multiple corporate spokespeople, and it took months of persistence and waiting and waiting and waiting. But ultimately, she did luckily manage to get access to the API. Unfortunately, it wasn't nearly as helpful as she had hoped. The API itself was extremely restrictive, both in terms of the amount of data that she was allowed to download, but it was also very buggy. It changed frequently. And the whole process from waiting for the data to actually getting the data left her feeling pretty demoralized and unable to answer the questions that she had about what was going on inside these algorithmic black boxes. Now, why am I telling you all of this? I'm telling you this because unfortunately this story isn't a one-off example. It's just the tip of the iceberg. Every watchdog working in this space has a similar battle story, and they face a similar dilemma. And so the dilemma is as follows. If you worked with platforms through, for example, research partnerships or transparency reports, you usually can't get access to the data that you need. And if you work around the platforms by building scraping tools like we do at AlgorithmWatch, you might risk legal challenges over terms of service violations. And I'm sure that researchers at NYU right now can tell you a little bit more about that. So the situation that we're left with is that at the moment, watchdogs are completely reliant on platforms' goodwill to get access to the data that they need to understand how technology is shaping democracy. And stories like this show us that platforms' self-regulatory transparency just isn't good enough. If we want to understand automated decision-making systems, or AI, if we want to detect online harms, and if we want to provide policymakers with the evidence that they need to make decisions, then we're going to need to move beyond the buzzwords. And that's where the DSA comes in with our cheesy PowerPoint visuals. We think the DSA is an opportunity for the EU to set the global gold standard in platform governance by tackling the information asymmetries that prevent us from understanding what's going on in the digital public square. That's why we're asking EU legislators for binding rules outlining who can access data and who can apply for access to platform data. We're also asking legislators to base disclosure obligations off of the technical functionalities of a platform service, because we need information about micro-targeting, we need information about ranking, we need information about content moderation, and we can't be relying on platforms' own definition of what is and is not political. We're asking policymakers for an independent institution, a one-stop shop that can act as an intermediary between the intermediaries and the watchdogs. We want this independent institution to maintain relevant access infrastructure, so that would be public databases, forums, and virtual secure operating environments so that researchers can access data in a way that's in compliance with the GDPR. We want it to collaborate with national data protection authorities, cybersecurity agencies, and media regulators, or bouncers, to ensure appropriate levels of independence and oversight. And because data is only useful to people who know how to use it, we're also asking the institution to proactively support watchdogs so that they can make use of these tools through, for example, through collaborating with independent centers for AI or ADM. And of course, because of the sensitive nature of certain types of data, there are legitimate concerns to be raised regarding potential threats to user privacy. So we think that it's really imperative that this institution upholds GDPR's principles. And the good news is that we've learned through our project that the GDPR doesn't need to be seen as an obstacle. And that's why we're asking policymakers to learn from other sectors and integrate the best practices from those sectors to ensure that citizens can exercise their rights in an easy manner. Because the bottom line is that it shouldn't be easier to access highly sensitive health data than it is to access data about online advertising. In short, we're asking policymakers to make sure that transparency of algorithms isn't just an empty buzzword. Meaningful transparency is hard, and it needs to be designed carefully. And it will also take a lot of resources to get this right. But as we've already heard, Europe needs to get this right, and it can get it right. Because by now, I hope that I've managed to convince everyone that a healthy democracy depends on a strong and healthy public sphere, and most importantly, a strong and healthy fourth estate. And we can only have a strong and healthy fourth estate when watchdogs are free to speak truth to power and to understand the very public square that is the heart of our democracies. And now, as the Germans would say, we're based in Berlin, of course, thank you for your attention. That's enough for me, but if you want to learn more about the recommendations and read them perhaps in a non-cartoon form, then I think someone from the team is going to be linking the links to our website where you can read them in full. And now I would like to pivot over to our esteemed panel, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And I would like to introduce today's panelists. So I'll just allow everyone a moment here to put their video on so we can see your beautiful faces. Great. It looks like we have a full house. So that's wonderful because I know that there were some technical issues. Our first panelist is Alexandra Geese, and she's of course a member of the European Parliament. You can see on her banner in the background that she's a member of the Greens and the European Free Alliance, and she is a member of the Committee on Budgets as well as the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection. And we'll ask her a little bit about her work there shortly. But then next we have Jeff Osloos, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam's Institute for Information Law, and he was co-author of one of the stories or one of the studies that we commissioned in the framework of this project, and on which the recommendations that you've just seen are based off of. And in addition to wearing his scholar hat, he also has another hat, namely his activist hat. Before going to the University of Amsterdam, he's also worked with Center for Democracy and Technology and the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Then we have Dr. Daniela Bronstrup, who's Germany's Deputy Director for General and Digital Policy, Postal Policy, International Affairs, and Media at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. Quite the portfolio of very different topics. But among the topics that she's working on is the Digital Services Act for the German government. So very happy to have you here, Daniela. And then we have Roger Turk, who, and I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'm sure that there's a, okay, great. He is a spokesperson and policy advisor to Belgian MEP Chris Peters. And Chris is a member of the European People's Party, the EPP, Christian Democrats. And he is a member of several different committees in the Parliament. But for the purposes of our discussion, it's most important to highlight his role as rapporteur for the LIBE Committee's report on the DSA. And now, before we go into the discussion, I apologize that we weren't able to have time for a Q&A for our last, or for the Executive Vice President's speech, but I do want to give you guys the opportunity to ask your questions. I know we've been talking a lot about democracy, but I must inform you that this is a benevolent dictatorship. So in my role as moderator, I'm going to have to sort through which questions I will pose to the panel. But if you do ask questions, please be so kind as to list your name and organization, and try to be kind because I'll be managing a lot of different things here on Zoom. And I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. So now over to Alexandra and Roderick. The Executive Vice President mentioned the debates last week in the Parliament, and I know that it was a very important week for both of you. The European Parliament voted on 3 different own initiative reports. Alexandra, you were working very hard on the IMCO committee reports as a member of that committee, and Kaspitas was, of course, the special rapporteur for LIBE's report. And I think the debate reflected the complexity of some of the discussions that you've been having, and that we've also been having in the framework of our project over the last year. And while we saw some clear areas of consensus, of course, there were also points of contention. And luckily for us, there does seem to be broad support around the need to improve platform transparency. Roderick, Chris Peters said in the debates that the fundamentals of the e-commerce directive were great, but its greatest issue was in the area of transparency. So my question to both of you, Alexandra, but also Roderick, what were the discussions about what did the discussions about transparency look like in the different committees, and how are each of you thinking about how it can be made meaningful and useful? And of course, you represent 2 different ends of the political spectrum. So I'd also be keen to hear, what are the main differences, do you think, about how the different parties are approaching how to make transparency meaningful? And I see, Roderick, you've got your mic unmuted. So I would first have you respond to the question, and then we'll give Alexandra an opportunity to tell us a little bit about how she thinks about it.
All right, thanks a lot. I did not want to jump the gun by unmuting myself. Sorry about that, Alexandra. So yeah, as was mentioned, I'm the advisor to MEP Chris Peters, rapporteur of the LIBE DSA reports. It's absolutely right what you've mentioned, Kenzie. It's the foundations of the e-commerce directive. So we're talking about the internal market clause, we're talking about the prohibition on general monitoring, we're talking about limited liability. Those are foundations that really still have a broad support in the European Parliament across all political groups, which is really quite remarkable when you think that all of them were written 20 years ago. When we started our report, the research question, because of the LIBE scope, was really fundamental rights issues posed. So the research question for the report was, how do we achieve a more fair digital ecosystem? Of course, DSA should stimulate economic growth and all that, but that was not the scope. So the scope was, how do we fight illegal content online without disproportionate restrictions on free speech? And everything was on the table. We talked about prohibition of general monitoring. We also talked about obligation of general monitoring. We talked about full liability. We talked about no liability. We talked about obligation for anonymity. We talked about prohibition on anonymity. And going down all of these avenues, we ended up, quite frankly, right where we started off, by the same core foundations of the e-commerce directive. And yet, while that broad support is shared by many, you still have an overwhelming sense that we desperately need a revision, and the current rules aren't working anymore. So then the question becomes, what isn't working, and what should we change? And this is why this seminar is so apt, and why the core element is so great. It is transparency. The e-commerce directive failed to explicitly list legal obligations on transparency, and failed to provide a clear framework for an enforcement of those obligations. And so what you've had for the last 20 years, because of that, as a result of that, is basically a privatization of the fight against illegal content. So this idea that where is this distinction of what is possible and what is not possible has been determined by private companies. And it's a burden that a lot of them never asked for. Basically, it's a bit, a lackadaisical attitude by competent authorities. I think the follow-up was not there, was not nearly sufficient, both in terms of expertise, in terms of resources, you name it. So I think the analysis at the very start was, this transparency is the greatest lack of the e-commerce directive, and should be at the heart, at the core of the new proposal. So that's, I think, the background of the statement, and it's worth pointing out that this was agreed upon by all the groups. So we had a lot of discussions. Some of them were very much on the edge, and there were quite a few conflicts. You can compare the draft report to the ultimate DSA report. You can see that it changed quite a bit. But on this question of transparency, there really wasn't that big of a question. Of course, the discussion is, how do you implement this transparency? I think, to avoid speaking too long and to limit my time here a bit, I think the question here on this fight against illegal content is, you have the issue of there's no EU criminal code. So the definition of what is illegal and what can and cannot do is really shaped by values. And of course we have common values, but you still see that national definitions vary quite a bit. Yeah. So the idea that you can harmonize this fight completely, I don't think that's feasible, and that's certainly not the view of Geese. To give you a concrete example, hate speech, the definition of hate speech in Belgium and in Poland are fundamentally different. So it's really difficult to completely harmonize it. What we could harmonize and what we should harmonize is the procedural aspects, how we deal with it, whether we're talking about a notice and action mechanism, but also the transparency obligations themselves. And so in the view of Geese, it really needs to be quite a strong and rigorous enforcement of those transparency obligations. They need to be very far-reaching, otherwise we're making the exact same mistake of the e-commerce directive, and it needs to be harmonized within the digital single market. I've got a lot more to say, but I'll refrain from any additional for now.
Great, thank you so much, Roderick. Alexandra, over to you. Maybe just because Roderick focused so much on the fight against illegal content, maybe you could speak more to some of the discussions around how to deal with the harmful but legal stuff, which I think is arguably the most tricky area.
Yes, that obviously is a tricky area, and I have to say there was one party that in the IMCO committee, so not Geese herself, but the EPP that strongly pushed for including harmful content in the scope of the DSA. Fortunately, from our point of view, there was no consensus among the political parties for that. I mean, there was a progressive coalition that very clearly pushed against including harmful content, but I'm very happy for that. I think we share a common position with the Commission as well, that also sees that regulating harmful content opens the door to complete arbitrariness on the side of the platforms, which are basically monopoles, and it would open up really a very, very difficult situation, and this is not what we want. Therefore, we think the way to go is exactly what you are proposing. It is having more insight, having more transparency, because that will also help to deal with harmful content. And we do agree there's a lot of harmful content on there. I mean, there's a discussion flaring up in France in the past week for good reasons. People ask themselves, what is the contribution of social network to that kind of polarization of society as France is living right now? And I perfectly understand the debate. I just don't think we can solve it leaving it up to platforms to decide what is freedom of expression, what is content people are allowed to see and what not. That is the task of a democratic society in a state where you have rule of law, and we still have that in most European countries. So I hope this discussion is not coming back when we get there. It probably will, but I hope we will have the same majority focusing on really dealing with legal content. We fought for very clear notice and action procedures that are very differentiated according to the gravity of the content of the problems the content poses. And I think that's a very important point to make. But the other two important points I would like to make are the ones you've been working on, which is very important, which is transparency, and especially, very particularly, transparency of recommender systems. There was a report by the Wall Street Journal in May this year that said 1/3 of groups on Facebook have extremist content, and 64% of the members, so clear majority of the members, joined that group upon a recommendation by the Facebook algorithm. So this is something we need to look into, not whether there is content that we wouldn't want to see and that some people have the right to see, but how many people are really ending up in these groups, or how many people are looking at extremist or conspirational content in YouTube and falling in these rabbit holes? This is what we need to see. And therefore, we need the kind of transparency you are proposing. And I'm very happy to see that, especially in the IMCO report, where there was a green initiative, but the IMCO supported it. And where we really call on the Commission to address what we call the lack of transparency for recommendation systems of systemic operators, including for the rules and criteria for the functioning of such systems, and whether additional transparency obligations, information requirements need to be imposed. And we have some similar language in the URI report as well. So Parliament is clearly showing the way to Commission that we need obligations there, we need to address this. And I think your contribution is extremely helpful, because you really outline what the system could look like, what kind of safeguards we need, and what could very concretely be done, who should be doing it, and so on. So I'm really grateful for you pointing that out. I think the other big issue we need to face is advertising technology, because we know that one of the big drivers for these recommender systems, for the algorithms, to keep people hooked to a screen, and extremist and conspirational content helps to keep people hooked to the screen because it's interesting, unfortunately. So we really need to look into the advertising technology, and I think we should have a ban. We are fighting for a ban, for a phase out, and this is what Parliament clearly called for. Whether this was challenged with a split vote by the Renew Group, and there was a clear majority in Parliament for a phase out of personalized advertising that is based on the collection of huge amounts of data, of creating micro profiles of single people, and then directing advertising at them. And this is one of the drivers for extreme and harmful content on platforms, and this is something we should also address. And I'm very happy that both reports, the URI, I'm not sure about the LIBE report, maybe you can comment on that, but the URI and the IMCO report both picked this up, and there was a clear majority in Parliament that called on the Commission to introduce transparency for recommending algorithms and to phase out personalized behavior-based advertising. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Just to jump in. So in Article 40, Article 41, Article 6, we were calling for that kind of transparency exactly for that. So it calls for transparency on monetization policies of online platforms, calls for a legal base to assess whether and how content is amplified by recommendation engines. So I think we're very much on the same line there. The one political difference is this idea of personalized advertisement. I think in the view of my boss, so MEP Crispetis, in certain platforms, the risk is minimal and the benefits are quite large. So we're thinking, for example, on a platform like Zalando. If you have an account on there and they're tracing what you like to optimize the suggestions there, the impact there in terms of harmful content or illegal content or any kind of data is very limited. So we would very much be against a horizontal ban on personalized advertising.
I think this is one of the big battlefields, and I'm cognizant that we probably shouldn't try to dive into as interesting as it is. And as Algorithm Watch, we're also thinking about how we want to position ourselves on this question of all-out bans. But I think that it's good to see and to hear from both of you that we need better transparency, regardless about how advertising is impacting democracies. And once we have that evidence, perhaps we can have other types of legislative steps. But I want to turn now to Daniela and to Jeff as well, make sure they also have an opportunity to give the word or give their thoughts. But Daniela, we're jumping now from the EU perspective to the member state perspective. And you're here representing not just any member state, but Germany, which of course holds the council presidency at the moment. And Germany has been an innovator, for better or for worse, in the area of platform governments. It was one of the first countries to introduce transparency reporting through the NetzdG in this area of harmful, in the area of illegal content. And most recently, Germany's media regulators are thinking more about how to deal with the harmful but legal space. And they have amended their interstate media treaty to demand more transparency about the main criteria that intermediaries use to rank and sort information. And we know through the course of our project, we've heard from civil society organizations in Germany who work with the transparency reports from the NetzDG, and they've told us that they're just really not good at enabling them to have any kind of insight into how content moderation is happening in practice, especially for content that's not reported under NetzDG. So my questions to you, Daniela, are what has Germany learned from its experiences regulating intermediaries at the member state level, and how will it translate these experiences to the DSA now? And then, of course, I'll have to ask you, will Germany be advocating for more rigorous measures in the area of transparency and thinking it more concretely about data access for researchers so that they can understand the granular nuances of how content moderation works, for example?
Thank you, Kenzie, and good morning, everybody. Thank you also for inviting me to giving you the German perspective or experience we have, because yes, indeed, in 2017, in October, so 3 years ago right now, the Network Enforcement Act, the NetzDG, came into force, and that was after a really fierce, a very intense political debate in Germany, because as we see already this morning, this is not an easy debate. Coming right now to your question, in fact, we are right now amending the NetzDG, and we will contain a new provision which grants researchers access to social network data so that they gain insights into the functioning of the platforms and the process of the content dissemination. So maybe this is also a very early answer, but maybe it would be helpful also for the audience if I give a short overview about the NetzDG and what it does and how we also enforce it. Earlier on, we had already the question about the enforcement with Geese, and maybe it's helpful if I present right now what we have done in Germany. So the Network Enforcement Act aims to fight unlawful content on social networks more effectively. That includes, for example, insult, malicious gossip, defamation, public incitement to crime. And we had a fierce debate because, of course, on the other hand, we wanted to avoid overblocking. So the Act defines binding standards for effective and transparent complaints management for social networks with more than 2 million users. The operators of those social networks are subject to the following obligations. They must offer users an easily recognizable, directly accessible, and permanently available procedure for reporting criminal punishable content. So not the watchdog that has to sit in the waiting room. They must immediately take notice of content reported to them and examine whether that content might violate criminal law. They must take down or block access to manifestly unlawful content within 24 hours, and other criminal content must generally be taken down or blocked within 7 days. And the platforms must inform users of all decisions taken in response to their complaints and provide justification. So that is also the transparent element. The operators of certain networks are obliged to submit biannual reports on the handling of complaints, another transparent element. And these reports must contain information, for example, on the volume of complaints and the decision-making practices of the network. And of course, those reports must be made available on the internet for everybody. And now coming to the enforcement part, social networks that fail to set up complaints management systems or do not set up one properly are committing a regulatory offense. And that is punishable. It's punishable with a fine of up to 50 million euros per company. And to make sure that all networks can be addressed by authorities, they must, regardless of where they are based, name a person in Germany who is authorized to receive service of process and information requests from law enforcement authorities. So have you been successful with that Enforcement Act? And it's called Enforcement Act because, of course, it's referring to the e-commerce directive and the notice and action principle that is implemented there. So have you been successful? Well, we have evaluated after 3 years the act, and the main results are that first, user complaints are processed now more quickly and more effectively. And the report also states that there is no overblocking in Germany by social networks, at least not so far. So we believe that we have found a balance between, of course, the need to protect users and on the other hand, to maintain the freedom of speech. So in our view, the Network Enforcement Act, or cornerstones of them, can give an example when we now talk about the DSA and how to implement the notice and action principle and how to improve transparency. And as you've asked about the new interstate media treaty, this is of course something that is done by the federal states, so the Bundesländer, but maybe very briefly on that as well. They create now, it passed just this week in the last Bundesland, so they create now new rules for the media industry, for platform providers, and for the first time, also for the so-called intermediaries such as Facebook and Google. And that is new because beforehand, the treaty was only a broadcasting treaty. The core goals of the Interstate Media Treaty are to improve transparency and the ability for people to freely form their opinions in the digital age. Under the transparency provisions, intermediaries will be required to provide information about how their algorithms operate. And that includes the criteria that determine how content is accessed and found, and the central criteria that determine how content is aggregated, selected, presented, and weighted. And as it comes into force now, we'll have to see how that works. I think there is, of course, an interesting question of how to implement that then in reality, but we are looking forward to that. And having said all that, maybe to your last question about how we see the DSA package, we welcome very much that package because we think that after 20 years, the e-commerce directive needs a revision, and that should be adapted to the new digital developments and the competitive landscape that we have discussed already today. So it's important that we establish a level playing field between the service providers in the EU and those established in third countries. And we also share the Commission's view that the current legal framework at EU level, including the competition law, doesn't yet specifically address the economic power that large online platforms with significant network effects have. We therefore welcome the new rules, and we have the impression that a lot of other member states are on the same line. The German presidency has given member states and the Commission the possibility to discuss these important issues at a very early stage at our informal ministers meeting of the Telecommunication Council in October. And the ministers agreed on most of the points we raised there. And we are now looking forward to the discussion with all member states and of course also with the public. We have the impression that we will have to hand over, of course, the package to our Portuguese colleagues, but we will give the floor to the Commission to present the package in the Telecommunications Council in December. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. This was quite the rich overview, and I think you also asked some questions that we could probably have an entire different webinar on. For example, whether or not Netzdige could be seen as an example. But I do want to give Jeff now an opportunity to maybe dive into some of the nitty-gritties. We presented, of course, the cartoon rendition of our recommendations, but Jeff worked on the academic rendition. And I think this is particularly interesting in line with what you just mentioned, Daniela, about some of the challenges that at least we anticipate maybe seeing in Germany with implementing the interstate media treaty. How is it that we can actually ensure transparency around personalization and how algorithms rank and sort and curate content online? So Jeff, the recommendations that we presented today were, of course, a part of a case study where you looked at what lessons we can learn from other legal frameworks at enabling transparency. Could you tell us how you decided on the different cases that you looked at, and maybe what the main challenges are for the regulators here or those public policy experts? What questions did your team still have about how we can make data access work in practice?
So hi everyone, and thanks also Mackenzie for inviting me to join this panel. It's also great to see that there seems to be some consensus, at least on transparency, at the very least, among policymakers, even though there's quite some disagreement on the other measures, like the notice and action measures. With that, I also want to place a huge disclaimer that we should really take care that we do not look at transparency as this silver bullet that's going to solve everything. It is a precondition, you know, for exploring and scrutinizing and identifying many issues. But then we need further, you know, legal rules in place, you know, to take the next steps. So that's important not to lose sight of. Getting back to those policy discussions, you know, in platform governance, transparency has been this common denominator in most of these discussions. And as sort of like when we were starting to work on this specific report, we got a bit frustrated because everybody agrees on transparency, everybody agrees on data access, but when you really dig down, it's hard, like how should this actually look like in practice, and how should this be operationalized? What should the governance structure look like, and so on. And this requires perhaps less, you know, flashy, sexy work, but really requires more, I guess, more work in trying to explore, you know, what the necessary safeguards are that we need to consider for this. And so we took a step back for that. From the platform governance debate, which is such a rabbit hole, you know, it's easy to get lost in and lose sight of the bigger picture, and really looked at this broad range of transparency and data access frameworks that we have in place already in many different sectors. So there's a lot to be learned from these other transparency frameworks. And we haven't come across really other studies that did a comparative analysis of what can be learned, you know, from these existing frameworks, some of which work well, some of which work less well, and what we can learn specifically for the challenges that we're facing in this platform governance debate. And so we selected 2 case studies based on sort of 2 clusters of issues that we identified in the platform governance transparency debate. And the first one is sort of what we called the incentive problem. So essentially, you know, platforms have very strong disincentives to provide meaningful transparency and data access for a variety of legitimate or less legitimate reasons. And then secondly, a cluster of issues relates to GDPR concerns. Much of the data that we would like to see released by platforms raise significant data protection issues, and that we might not leave up to, you know, the platforms to decide on who gets access to that information. And so for the former, the incentive problem, we looked at this EU regulation with a very sexy name called the European Pollutant Release and Transfer Register, or the EPRTR regulation. But so in short, this regulation, you know, it lays down this quite advanced and tiered transparency infrastructure, which is specifically targeting economic actors with little to no incentive to be open about their, you know, their polluting operations. And so far it seems to be working well. I mean, there's issues with it, but if you want to dig deeper, I'm happy to elaborate later, or you can read the report. And then for the second cluster of issues, so GDPR concerns, we looked at a sector where highly sensitive personal data is shared for research purposes, the health sector, even more relevant in 2020, I guess. And so specifically, we looked at this very recent initiative in Finland called FinData. It's not about financial data, it's about the health data. So FinData is for Finland, of course. And so in this case study, there's at the center, there's this independent institution which facilitates access to potentially highly sensitive personal data to potentially any researcher in the world. So we basically conclude there that if it works for medical data, it sure as hell should work for social media or other platform data as well. That doesn't mean it's an easy task. There's a lot of hard work to do, in devising this robust transparency governance structure. But we've set out some best practices that we think are quite useful to consider, and and I hope it might inspire the policymakers to do so.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for this overview into the kind of nitty-gritty details. And you make our point also for us, which is very convenient for me as a moderator and advocacy person in the room. There was a question that I thought was really interesting from Elizabeth Hoffenberger-Pippin. I hope that I have that down right. She was asking about, this was during the Executive Vice President's keynote, but I think it's nevertheless interesting also for our discussion, and it came up throughout the course of the project. If we're obliging service providers to submit reports regularly to authorities, could there be a risk that some EU countries use this as an opportunity to shut down service providers that don't follow the political line? So here, how do we kind of toe that line on the one hand of wanting platforms to be more transparent, but at the same time acknowledging that we're dealing with very delicate issues of freedom of expression, and that it can be easy for governments that are perhaps potentially illiberal. And here we don't need to look at authoritarian regimes. We can also look within the EU to some rather troubling anti-democratic trends. How can we make sure that we, on the one hand, hold platforms accountable, but on the other hand, also make sure that governments are held accountable and not kind of forcing platforms to, or punishing platforms if they don't carry out the political agenda. So maybe I would ask our EU policy folks for their thoughts on that, how to kind of toe that line.
Yeah, should I start? We have asked that question ourselves because it's an absolutely relevant question. And it's a very fine line, as you say, because the risk is always there. The fact is the risk is already there because we know that especially right-wing extremist movements are very good at using the algorithms at gaming the systems. So that exists whether you have the data or not. I think, and you have that in every kind of system that requires transparency. For example, transparency on financial transactions. You can always argue that there are some countries where it's good if dissidents can hide their money and the government doesn't have access to that. But that's not a good idea for not having transparency in banks, for example. Anyway, so that is a problem and we have to acknowledge it. I think we can approach the solution in two ways in Europe, speaking of Europe specifically, where we have two countries that are clearly problematic and a series of others that have issues. Having a European agency, as you are proposing it, that helps at least to balance the whole thing. Because I hope that Europe will remain a democratic continent, even if we have a few countries that are not considered democracies by independent think tanks anymore, like Hungary, for example. But as a whole, it's still a continent with a strong democracy, I believe. The other point is what you focus on is this broad network of institutions working together, watchdogs, journalists, and so on, to having a really broad network, what you call the fourth estate. I think that helps as well, that you don't have only one centralized agency that's responsible, but you have a lot of watchdog, of investigative journalists, scientific institutions that can issue opinions and statements and influence a public debate. One thing I like a lot is an idea that was brought up by Article 19 and David Kay and other people, and it's the idea of having social media councils. So having civic councils or of independent experts, or even something like the Irish Citizens Council, really with normal people, who could then take the results coming out of the transparency process, well explained by journalists, to translate the data into intelligible language, and who could then sort of promote a broad debate on the results. And in order to discuss what do we want, what don't we want, I think the feedback from this council would also influence the platforms and help to check on governments that might try to abuse this data and this transparency.
Thanks, Alexandra. Roderick, if you want to quickly react, I just ask you, keeping an eye on the time to keep it short. And then if unless you guys, Jeff or Daniela, want to also contribute, then I can go on to try to squeeze in another question before we go to our closing remarks.
All right, I'll keep it as short as possible. I think the 3 draft reports all mentioned an EU agency in one form or another. It's worth pointing out that language was toned down in all the final reports. I think in the Libe report, the language is still one of the strongest. I'll briefly read it out. So supports a strong and rigorous enforcement by an independent EU oversight structure. Why is Kees Peters advocating for this? Well, basically, we talked to some representatives of member states, non-German ones to be specific, who made it very clear to us that, for example, analyzing the algorithms and the effect of the algorithms was beyond their current expertise and was beyond their funding. So I think in the way we set up oversight and enforcement of that oversight, we should be mindful that this is a European digital single market, and the effect, it goes beyond one member state, and therefore the enforcement should go beyond one member state. So I think there we're on the same line. Quickly on the rule of law and the issue of undemocratic governments. It's one of the core challenges of the European Union. I don't think we need to be coy about that. But that's an issue that you have to tackle at its roots. And you cannot, out of fear of that, compromise every other piece of legislation. So I think the remark of MEP Geese was absolutely on point in that, and I can only support it.
Okay, thank you so much. I just got my timer going off saying that we only have 5 minutes left. And there were a couple of questions that I would have loved to dig into about whether or not, or how we can prevent transparency from just being something like a cookie wall where you click, 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 and yes, 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 and it's not kind of meaningful in any kind of way. But I would direct you there to our report, perhaps rather selfishly. We've thought about that. And then I would just like to ask all of our panelists for a quick rapid round here. We've shared our vision with you all about what we see as absolutely necessary for the DSA, namely transparency and data access for research. Now, and we also heard from the Executive Vice President what her vision is for the DSA, and I was also very pleased to see that we seem to be very values aligned. Now, I would like to hear from you. Imagine you're 20 years into the future and the DSA has been enacted and life is great. There's no coronavirus. And what is the internet, the post-DSA internet look like in an ideal world? Jeff, would you like to start us off? I'm just going to pick on you, and then maybe we can go to Daniela, and then Roderick and Alexandra, you get the last word.
Yeah, so I think perhaps a point that I really want to emphasize here is that, I mean, we're talking a lot about transparency in order to hold platforms accountable, and that is surely a vital element to consider. As an academic, perhaps I'm biased, but I think it is also crucial to consider the broader need for transparency, simply to understand, you know, these digital infrastructures that penetrate, you know, virtually every aspect of our lives, and to simply, you know, enable research. I mean, and so in that regard, I think it's also important to keep that transparency framework relatively neutral. We also advocate for an independent, you know, institution that would enforce and oversee such a transparency framework, and also advocate that its mandate is limited to just a transparency facilitator that can then perhaps interface, you know, with competition authorities, consumer protection agencies, data protection authorities, and different interest groups. But so as to prevent, you know, this institution from being politicized, and really enabling the many, you know, social scientists and many researchers in other fields, you know, to get access to the data that they need in order to do their research. So that's what I'm hoping for, I guess, like that in 20 years we have this vibrant, you know, civil society with academics and activists and journalists having really the tools and being equipped and valued, you know, for their role as public watchdog, but also, you know, to investigate social issues more broadly.
Thanks, Jeff. Daniela, it's on to you, and I would remind you to please keep it short.
Okay, I hope that we will have then a modern regulatory framework that foresees new responsibilities for platforms, but without setting obstacles to innovation and small and medium-sized companies. I would love to have a framework that is improving competition and also protecting citizens. Thanks.
Thank you. Very succinct, Roderick.
All right, keeping it short. I'd like the internet to remain a beacon for free speech. I think that's crucial. I would like to see stronger attention of competent authorities on the internet. So a framework where what's illegal offline does become illegal online. And that can only be achieved with a meaningful and transparent co-regulatory approach. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Roderick. Alexandra.
Yes, I basically agree to what the previous speaker said, and I would like to add, I would really like to see it as a space for freedom of expression, and also freedom of expression for women, for minorities, for vulnerable groups, because even if we formally have freedom of expression today in the internet, studies show that 50% of women, for example, are afraid to express their opinion there because of hate speech. And therefore, I would like really to see this free and vibrant democratic space with a lot of different actors and where everybody can freely and without fear express his or her opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, for closing us off there. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I don't want to keep anyone past the time because you've already been very generous with your time, but I would just like to close by saying, or by returning to some of the remarks that we heard already from the Executive Vice President, that I really like what she said, that the online world and the offline world are kind of one and the same, and that really what we're fighting here is for liberal democracy. And I think also for me, so maybe just a personal note, the reason that I became interested in these topics to begin with is because I'm from the US, and next week is a big week for us. As you can imagine, there's a lot of discussion about the extent to which platforms have been involved in, you know, creating some real challenges for democracy. And so I think, unfortunately, we're not going to be the ones to lead here. And a lot of people, including many of the signatories to our recommendations, are looking to Europe. So it's important that Europe get it right. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your visions as well. It's not every day that you get to think very positively about the future of the internet. So I think that's a nice note to go off on. And then I would just like to thank the panelists for joining us today. I would also like to thank the Executive Vice President for her keynote. It was stellar. I'm excited to put it on our website. I would like to thank the AlgorithmWatch team, especially my colleagues Panellique and Annalena, who helped me with the visuals a lot. And the EPC team, of course, Johannes did a lot of work in the background. And then also everyone who was a part of this year-long project, including our academic partners at the Mainz Media Institute and University of Amsterdam, and then Civitatis, who pays the bills and keeps the lights on, the internet on. Well, actually, that's me these days. And then lastly, the organizations who signed on. And again, I can point you to our website in the box. Don't know where it is for you. But please do check them out, share them, spread the word, and have a nice rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.